proof of point. Come on, people, if you've got this remote, raise your hands, come on. That's pretty good, right? So we've just demonstrated using human beings how gossip works. Now imagine if you were computers. Imagine how much more efficient that would be. I'm totally out of breath. I should have put a break in. So where this leads us is to the basis of SWIM.
We're detecting process crashes. Remember, I was talking about, we were going to come back to that. And process crashes is very key in distributed systems, because maybe it's not always a process crash. We need to look at grey failures. We need to differentiate between the concept of a fail stop or a process crash and something which might just be a transient failure. What if it's actually the probe which is a problem as opposed to the node which is being probed? So Swing took that original approach. It is kind of dealing with this concept of fail-stop processes as opposed to what we term as sort of a Byzantine failure. And this means that the process under suspicion might just be not running, or it might just be temporary failing, or you might have a problem with the probing service itself. And the term Byzantine failure is just anything that isn't really a hard fail. So it's things like flaky networks. It's things like you could just have high CPU. And the term itself, it comes from Leslie Lamport's paper, where she describes the sort of the two generals problem. And the concept behind that is that you have two generals out in the field. They need to decide whether they're going to attack or retreat. If they both attack, they win. If they both retreat, then they live to fight another day. But if one of them attacks and the other retreats, then one of them is going to lose. So the problem is, how do they come to the consensus that they should both do the same thing? And back onto that sort of grey failure problem, what you get is a situation where if this last message is lost, then they're never going to agree consensus. It's very, very common indeed. And in fact, there was a paper from Microsoft where they sort of described such occurrences based on their knowledge from operating Azure. And they state that the major availability breakdowns and performance anomalies we see in cloud environments tend to be caused by subtle underlying faults, i.e. grey failures, rather than fail stop. Now, they do discuss an approach. They kind of discuss an approach to be able to deal with this Byzantine failure, and that's Byzantine fault. So the concept with this is that if you need to agree consensus, then what the generals are going to do is they're going to ask each other. If one of the generals disagrees, then as long as you can maintain a sort of a quorum of opinion, then you can always come to a consensus on what the outcome should be. Which sounds perfect for our problem, but unfortunately Microsoft again in the same paper go on to describe that Byzantine fault tolerance isn't really suitable. And it's not suitable for the reasons here, that it's complex to implement, it's not necessarily proven, and it causes a high network overhead. So how does SWIM manage grey failure? So the SWIM paper goes on to describe an approach. And what it states is that rather than just marking a node as immediately failed, it will mark it as suspected. So we don't get any pings back. So rather than gossiping that a node has failed, what I'm going to do is I'm going to gossip that I suspect node B is misfunctioning. And the benefit of kind of the suspicion approach is that any node can refute that allegation. And again, because we're using this gossip-based protocol, there's a very good chance that the node which is under suspicion is actually going to get the message and it's going to say, well, you're suspecting me to fail, but I haven't failed. And it can then gossip the refutation. So you don't end up with this instance where you're going to get these flapping nodes. But there again are some limitations to SWIM, because the original paper mentions 55 nodes, and quite often we're operating at a much, much larger scale than 55 nodes. Certainly some of our users are running thousands and thousands of nodes. And we kind of found this out. So from our users dealing with console and running this massive scale, they kind of reported back and they're saying, well, we're getting this flapping. We end up with these situations where there's a large number of false positives being marked in the member list. So we looked at this, and the HashiCorp research team wrote a paper and determined that there should be an extension to SWIM, which they called LifeGuard. So LifeGuard's not a complete replacement for SWIM. It suggests 3 modifications. And 3 modifications are that we should deal with dynamic fault detector timeouts. So we should have a self-awareness that it may be us which is faulty rather than the probe node. And we should look at dynamic suspicion timeouts. So in the instance that we have a suspicion, we should be able to configure that accordingly. And also refutation timeouts. We should be able to configure all of those things. And the first part looks at that sort of dynamic fault detection. So it allows the probing node to assume that it may be at fault. So rather than gossiping these false suspicions, it can kind of take a little bit of self-reflection and say, well, maybe it's me that's broken. So when a node sends out a probe, or multiple probes, and it doesn't receive a response, that's kind of its first step to start suspecting that itself is a problem. You see, there's 2 situations of not receiving those nodes. One could be that the network as a whole is completely knackered, but more probably it's that I'm sort of having a transient failure. And then when we get into that situation, due to this self-awareness, what we're going to do is we're going to modify our probe timeouts accordingly. We're also going to implement a new addition to the suspicion, because with a standard suspicion, you're only going to get a probe, a companion probe, you're only going to get an ACK. If there's no response from B, then you don't hear anything at all. Now, if you're at fault, you might not be receiving the ACKs because you're faulty. It might not be that F and B haven't sent them. So what we do is we say we're always going to send a message. So we add this concept of a NAC. And a NAC will be sent if one of the assisting nodes doesn't receive a probe. So if G doesn't receive either an ACK or a NAC before the timeout,
願いします。
はい、ご苦労
あ、
様です。
大丈夫です。大丈夫です。
はい、大丈夫です。
はい。
326円です。330円お預かりいたします。4円の配信になります。ありがとうございました。失礼いたします。ありがとうございます。
ああ。